Senator Seidman.
And actually, I'm going to pass the torch to the Honourable Senator Patterson.
Okay,
thank you, Mr.
Patterson.
Chair. If I may, as a member of the Aboriginal Peoples Committee, I'd like to just take a bit of time to discuss this amendment. Mr. Chair, as committee members will know, consultation with Aboriginal peoples is very demanding, and there's a lot of litigation around it. And we've had issues with consultation with Aboriginal peoples with S3, which was dealt with in the Senate, I think very respectfully. The Prime Minister and the government are working to advance reconciliation and renew the relationship with Aboriginal peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. And this amendment would heed the pleas of Indigenous and Northern communities to be adequately consulted and supported in that spirit of reconciliation. And I do want to point out that Senator Christmas recommended that this issue be studied by the Aboriginal Peoples Committee. We were grateful that the Senate agreed to assign that important task to us. And we found a very high degree of interest in the bill and a very large number of concerns that were expressed to us by witnesses. We asked the government for a summary of engagement and consultation with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis governments, organizations, and communities on cannabis legalization and regulation. And, you know, with the greatest of respect to Parliamentary Secretary Blair, the consultation was really quite threadbare. First of all, the task force consultation involved 5 meetings, and they met with, they said they wanted to consult with the Inuit, so they met with the Inuit Tapiri Kanatami. Now, I've spoken in the House, in the Senate, about consultation with the Inuit, and I represent the largest population of Inuit in Canada in Nunavut. And the designated rights holder for the Inuit in Nunavut and in the other regions of Inuit regions of Canada is not Inuit Tapiri Kanatami. It's a national organization conveniently located in Ottawa, which is an effective advocacy and lobbying organization, but it is not the designated rights holder, and the president of ITK appeared before our committee and confirmed that the few meetings that had been held with ITK did not represent consultation under the land claims agreements with right holders. But there were 5 meetings held by the task force, and 1 meeting held by Health Canada officials with the Chiefs of Ontario up until February 28th, 2017, and I'm looking at the document the government provided us. And that was all that happened until the bill was drafted and presented to Parliament, first reading in the House of Commons, April 13th, 2017. So consultation really, to be respectful, should be in advance of government action, not after government action. So there have been consultations that took place following government action, and I have the list here. Frankly, Mr. Chair, this is not the kind of broad, respectful consultation that is expected and has been demanded by litigation and precedent. Some of the consultations were by teleconference. Some of them were panel presentations at other meetings. Some of them were roundtables, information sharing, and this is what we heard at the committee, that we haven't been consulted. In fact, Parliamentary Secretary Blair said that many people told us they weren't ready, and in fact, I think he was actually admitting the point that the committee wished to make to the Senate was that the Aboriginal people are feeling generally that they haven't been properly consulted and they're not ready for this legislation. And I do have the two resolutions of the Assembly of First Nations at their assembly, their special assembly in December 5, 6, and 7 in Ottawa. And they were two detailed resolutions that very clearly said that they weren't ready, that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples required pre and informed consent on initiatives like this. They asked that their inherent right to self-government be respected and reflected in the legislation. We heard from the First Nations Tax Commission. This is a body established by Parliament that they tried to be consulted on the legislation and just didn't get the opportunity. And they're the folks that gave us very compelling evidence that First Nations governments are going to be bearing the impact, health, social, and education, of some of the negative impacts of cannabis. And yet, because of their exclusion from the excise tax agreement that's already been made to divide those revenues up between the provinces, territories, and federal government, they're going to be left out of the opportunity to have resources to deal with these social impacts in their self-governing communities. They said that if the excise tax issue is not dealt with before the bill is passed or comes into force, it will become yet another legal morass like for the illegal cigarette trade. And I know Parliamentary Secretary Blair told us today that engagement is ongoing, that issues that I'm going to refer to shortly that were cited by the Aboriginal Peoples Committee were being engaged on with Aboriginal communities. And he gave us a list that I think addressed the subjects that the Aboriginal Peoples Committee had identified: economic opportunities, the need for additional consultation, funds for community-based treatment, funding for culturally appropriate education and materials, and he talked about the new fiscal relationship. But colleagues, we're being asked to trust the government that these talks are going on and will presumably have good results. So the Assembly of First Nations made a recommendation, as did the Aboriginal Peoples Committee, that implementation be delayed for a year to allow these consultations to properly take place. I'm not proposing an amendment to delay the coming into force by a specific time, but I would suggest to the committee members, Parliamentary Secretary Blair assured us today that the items set out in the unanimous committee recommendation of the Aboriginal Peoples Committee are well in hand. So all this amendment asks is that the government report to Parliament on what it has done or not done. And I do understand Parliamentary Secretary Blair was sincere about the compelling discussions and conversations he's had with Aboriginal peoples and at the Assembly of First Nations. So let's hear let's hear some results other than a short report at this committee stage before the bill comes into force. So having said that, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to present our recommendations, which were unanimous, and our committee, I may not need to say, operates on a nonpartisan basis. It includes most of the Aboriginal senators that sit on the Senate, and we work together in a nonpartisan way on this issue. The amendment proposes simply that we ask the government to come back to Parliament and report on these issues. And I do say that the fiscal relationship and the excise tax collection and sharing issue is of vital importance to First Nation self-governments. It can't be left till after the pie has been carved up and after the law is put into place. We don't want another situation like illegal cigarettes, which is precisely what Chief Manny Jules warned us could and would happen. So consequently, Mr. Chair, I would like to move that Bill C-45 be amended in Clause 226 on page 124, A, by replacing line 20 with the following: 226 sub 1, subject to subsections 2 and 3, the provisions, and B, by adding the following after line 29. 3, no order may be made under subsection 1 unless the minister has cause to be tabled in both houses of Parliament a report setting out A, a summary of the observations made and concerns expressed at public consultations with Indigenous peoples, including those in relation to, sub I, the development of educational materials and programs culturally and linguistically adapted to Indigenous peoples, include respecting the health risks associated with cannabis use. Sub II, the need for the establishment and funding of mental health and addiction programs, residential treatment and healing centers, and treatment centers culturally and linguistically adapted to Indigenous peoples, both in and in proximity to their communities. III, the need for nursing and police services culturally and linguistically adapted to Indigenous peoples. IV, the desirability for Indigenous communities to adopt their own measures respecting the legalization of cannabis. And V, tax collection and revenue sharing with the Indigenous peoples. And B, the measures to be taken respecting the concerns expressed by Indigenous peoples during the public consultations.
Okay, further comment? Well, I'm going to enter into the commentary here. These different parts that are noted here that need to be discussed, I don't think there's any disagreement with any of that. And as Mr. Blair pointed out, these are underway, and we even have later in our observations, we even have a resolution to that very effect, that these matters need to be undertaken immediately. The difficulty I have with this is the first part that says no order may be made under subsection 1 unless the minister has cause to be tabled. That means there would be an indefinite hiatus between royal assent and whenever those conditions are met. And that I think is the biggest problem, because from the day this bill gets royal assent, people out there will think it's the law now, it's legal. But it won't be if there's this delay. It could take, the Aboriginal Committee suggested, up to a year he's not putting a time frame on it, but it could be a year, it could be longer, it could be shorter, but it's indefinite. And I think that kind of hiatus will be very damaging to Indigenous people. It'll be very damaging to Indigenous youth, because it means that even though the royal assent has been given, there is a lot of uncertainty as to what law is really in effect. And I guess the existing law, until it finally comes into effect, is still prevailing, even though most people will think it hasn't, that it has changed. So I think that's the difficulty that I see with this one, is that first part. Yes, Senator Seidman.
Yeah, exactly. Well, having listened to Senator Patterson, who actively participated in pre-study review of the Committee on Aboriginal Affairs, and having listened to, on Friday, people from the department tell us that things are in this phase, sort of the very initial phases of putting some funding together, planning, preparing, putting down various organizational things. But, for example, we heard on Friday that there are no residential addiction treatment centers, none, zero, up where they're needed.
In the 3 territories.
Exactly. And so, knowing that we're dealing with a community that is particularly vulnerable, at least that is what we've heard in our witness testimony, young people who are at risk, how could we possibly ignore it? So, and that's just one item in a long list of issues that remain to be dealt with and reported about. And I think that's really then the bottom line, as Senator Patterson put forward. He's not saying 1 year. It's up to the government. If the government produces a report to Parliament, which is what he's asking for, which is what this amendment is asking for, the minister caused to be tabled in both houses of Parliament a report setting out a summary, and he lists it all. That could happen in a month, for example. You know, I mean, there's no requirement that it's a year. So it's really up to the government when that report is tabled. And that's what's being asked for. And I can't imagine how a committee that has expert testimony, listens to it for weeks, understands the North far better than we do, and makes a unanimous recommendation. All members of the committee, nonpartisan. It's not like it's a conservative recommendation or a ISG recommendation or a liberal recommendation. It's made by all members of the committee. So I can't see how we could possibly ignore it. And so I will support this amendment.
Senator Gold.
Thank you. I think we all share the concerns that were raised both before the Aboriginal Peoples Committee and by members of the committee. And certainly, I hope that all Canadians become sensitized to the real challenges, the lack of resources, or the inadequate resources, certainly, and some of the possible impacts on some communities. I think we were also encouraged that the government has placed significant resources, financial and other, in place, and is now working with communities to plan, and it takes time, whether it's treatment centers or other appropriate educational provisions. But I think this amendment with all due respect, is inappropriate, or I would not support it. Let me give you my reasons briefly. First, a true nation-to-nation relationship between the Government of Canada and our Indigenous peoples requires consultations, to be sure. And those consultations will and should take time. We have a lot of different communities. They're differently situated, both geographically and in terms of their legal status. And indeed, it's not even clear what the duty to consult fully comprises. It's currently the law in Canada that the duty to consult does not actually extend to the legislative process. Now, I think that might change. There's a case before the courts. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we stand on the narrow parameters of the law. But it is still the case that there has been discussions, engagement. It's not enough, according to some. It was enough, according to others. But there is a gray area of law in which we have to realize that we're operating. Different communities have different legal powers vis-a-vis their power through bylaws or other legislative measures to restrict or regulate cannabis on the lands over which they have control. They range from full rights of self-government, either recognized in treaties or by virtue of rights never ceded, to those who are under the auspices of the Indian Act, where the bylaw powers over intoxicants are the subject of some considerable disagreement, at least between certain communities and the government. So there's complicated issues that will take some time, that are underway, but will take some time. Most importantly, this will have the effect of delaying the implementation, and that will continue to expose Canadians, including Indigenous Canadians, to the ongoing criminalization that follows from the maintenance of the status quo. Indigenous men and women and youth are overrepresented in our criminal justice system, tragically overrepresented in our prisons, and every day that this bill does not come into force exacerbates the problem. So I believe, colleagues, that despite the serious issues and important needs that are identified and were identified by the committee, it is not appropriate to delay implementation of this bill, and I'll be voting against the amendment.
I should point out we have a couple of membership changes here. They've gone to their bullpen, and they've come up with Senator Gold for Senator Ahmedvar, and Senator Lankin is now here for Senator Dean, and they have the appropriate paperwork. Senator Platt.
Thank you, Chair. You know, we have not had a cannabis bill in 150 years. And now all of a sudden we're in an awful hurry to get it done because people are breaking the law. We have a government who ran an election on bringing in a cannabis bill, and we're 2.5 years into their mandate. Now all of a sudden we're in an awful hurry to bring in a law. If they were in such a hurry to bring in a law, they should have brought it in October 20th, 2.5 years ago. The chair talked about people will be in limbo because they will think it is the law after royal assent. Well, the fact of the matter is that even if the bill is passed as is, it will not be legal after royal assent. There is a period of time, and we've been told that it might be in September before this, in fact, becomes legal. So there is a period of time there. Again, I have said this on a few of the amendments. We have highly reputable senators on all of our committees, including Legal and Constitutional Affairs, that unanimously approved a few amendments that we rejected here. And the same thing on the Aboriginal Peoples Committee now. And as Senator Seidman said, a very non-partisan committee. They have unanimously recommended an amendment. There is no desperate hurry to bring this bill to fruition. And the government has their right. If we pass the amendment here today, it will be in our report that will be debated in the Senate, and the entire Senate can overturn it if they choose. And if they don't, and we pass it and we send it over to the other place, the government can reject it, as they do with amendments if they don't think that this is an amendment they want to deal with. They have that option. It is our responsibility to do the right thing here, not the expedient thing, but the right thing. The minister and the government, the prime minister, they can rush this along if they think it is necessary. There is no one-year time limit here. It is up to them to decide whether they want to consult, as they have an obligation to do, and in fact, as they have said they have done, which is clearly not entirely accurate. So they can move this along, and they can start consultations. They can start them tomorrow morning if they really think this is necessary. So, colleagues, it's our responsibility, again, as I said, to do the right thing, not the expedient thing. The First Nations peoples have a right to be heard on this. We allow them a certain amount, or I should rephrase that, not we allow. They have certain rights in self-government, and they should certainly have that right here too. They have the right to declare their communities dry reserves. They should have the right to deal with this as they best see fit. It's been said that they are overrepresented in the prisons. Well, the chiefs and councils are trying to deal with that, and here we're going to push marijuana bills on them when they haven't been consulted. So if we're concerned about their overrepresentation in the prison system, then let's let them make some decisions for their communities. So with that, I will certainly be supporting this amendment.
Senatrice Meiji.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't repeat what has already been said, and that is the fact that the consultations are not necessarily well defined, but I don't want to be simplistic here, but I'm wondering whether point B about education, and then we talk about resources for people with drug problems, could we not use the implementation of the Act to promote all of this? Things might go more quickly that way rather than more slowly. It's not just a problem with cannabis. The Cannabis Act will allow us to move forward, but there are other things needed as well. We need the services, we need education. So if we legalize cannabis, we are saying that we require education to be provided, and even if we don't have rehab centers necessarily included here, but we need services for people suffering from drug abuse or mental health. Maybe I'm being naive here, but it seems to me that if we delay the bill, we will delay those services as well.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to support this amendment, and I, you know, we hear the Indigenous community time after time saying, you push things on us, you create laws that don't fit for us, and you force us to accept this. And and we've promised we're going to change. And when are we going to start to listen to the wisdom of the elders and the wisdom of the people who this will directly impact? So I'm going to support it because I think we've clearly heard an ask for a delay. They're just asking to be able to deal with it better. And my goodness, we know there are an awful lot of problems. I don't think we want to add one more problem. So I will support the amendment. Thank you.
Senator Lankin and then Senator Munson.
Well, thank you. The content of the bullet points that you spoke to, I think, are very important. I don't support a delay in the legislation, though, and that's what this is about. That's what this would cause. I appreciate that there are certainly lots of voices that weren't heard, but there were lots that were as well. And one of the problems that I have with characterizations that I hear is when we talk about the Indigenous community as if it was one community, because we know it's not. It's multiple communities, it's multiple nations, it's multiple governance structures, and there are some, like the Mi'kmaq in New Brunswick, who have said don't delay. And there are people out in communities and nations out west that have a different perspective on this. So it's not all the same, like we heard in testimony on the pipeline issue as well. There are different views out there. I support the content of what you want the minister to report on, but not, which I realize is a lever that you want to use, the delay. And I understand it can be an effective lever, but I don't support delaying the legislation. So if, in fact, later on when we do observations, if the intent of an observation on this is accepted as has been proposed, I also have no problem with putting in some of these specifics. I think that they can be useful in terms of guidance. And I also think that, we have the minister returning, Senator Patterson, you would know better than I now when, but on phase 2 of the S3. And that broad consultation, I know in communities that it's not going to be confined to only the issues set out there, that these issues will be coming to the table as well. So maybe there's an opportunity when she comes back to ask her in advance to respond on some of these points as well.
Senator Munson.
Well, I've been hearing the argument that this government's in a hurry. Well, the country certainly hasn't been in a hurry. We've had a Ledeen Commission report in 1969 to 72 on decriminalizing the use of marijuana. And that sparked quite a debate at that particular time. That's a long time ago. We've had a conservative leader and a Senate Speaker, Pierre-Claude Nolin, in 1993, who certainly had his feet on the ground when it came to discussing and leading the way of a Senate report on legalizing marijuana. That's 15 years ago. And since that time, since 69, what has happened? Criminality, the bad guys, so to speak, have taken over the market. Children have abused the drug because they're buying it on a dark back street instead of on a main street in a regulatory form. Not understanding the health impacts of overconsumption of marijuana. So we've had a learned debate that has gone on for many, many years in this country. And I think the present government finally has responded responsibly to doing something about it. And dealing with the First Nations people, there has been consultation. There was in the task force. We have to take the parliamentary secretary at his word of what he said. There's one word I really sometimes phrase I have a difficulty with is with the deepest of respect, with the utmost of respect. I say this, I say that. What does that mean? I don't think it's very respectful. because you should be just saying it like it is without saying with the greatest respect, because I don't really think it's totally there. When it comes to changing and doing things and having what is called in this amendment about dealing with having medical clinics and all kinds of things in the north, you know, you have to keep fighting for things. Yes, because that's what reconciliation is all about, isn't it? But I've been fighting for 12, 15 years in the Senate of Canada for the government to have a fiduciary responsibility for dealing with autism and other issues in Aboriginal communities, both in the north and all across the country. And it hasn't. But if you keep pushing these things, bit by bit, incrementally, change does take place. So what do we want in the next year? For the Aboriginal children and elders to live in the shadows of no regulation? I don't think anybody wants that. And I think that as we can continue on the road of reconciliation, we'll be able to follow visionaries like Ledane, like Pierre-Claude Nolin, and like this government, even though I have some issues with some parts of the bill, that we have to get on with it. And that's why I'll be not supporting your amendment, sir, but at the same time, you do have at third reading another opportunity in another public forum to express your views. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have JS 15. I take it you want a recorded vote?
Chair, I've had my hand up for a
Oh,
long
I'm
time.
sorry, I didn't have you on the list. Well, I'll take Senator Wu and then yourself for the closing.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I don't want to delay this much longer, but I do have some fresh points to put on the table. I thank Senator Seidman for proposing the amendment and Senator Patterson for relaying the views of Aboriginal, which of course he's a member of. He is correct in saying that this amendment reflects some ideas that were brought up in Aboriginal affairs. I have the report in front of me. It should be very clear, though, that this amendment was not proposed by APA, and that if you look at it really carefully, there is in some senses let's say it's a pale version. It's a pale version of what was recommended by APA, and to that extent, it may even have some unintended consequences that are contra to the objectives of the very recommendations of the Aboriginal Peoples Committee. I'm referring, of course, to what this amendment calls for, which is simply that a report be tabled summarizing information gleaned on a range of things that Aboriginal peoples have expressed concerns about, but not implementing or not executing any of them. What we heard from Senator Seidman, from Senator Patterson, from Senator Platt, was how important it was to have action, to have these treatment centers, to have these programs in place before the bill can go ahead. I think that's unrealistic. But even this amendment doesn't do that. To the extent that you even believe that it is important for all these things to be put in place in First Nations communities before a bill can go ahead, this bill does not do it. In some senses, with due respect, and I will use that phrase, it comes across as a little bit platitudinous, because all the minister has to do is to table this report that she has heard, and this is the litany, and this is what we intend to do over the next so many years. This is not what First Nations people want. And so I do not have a vote, but I think it's wise of committee members to not further delay the implementation of the bill because of the negative consequences on Canadians and many, many First Nations communities, and to use the bill, the legalization framework, the monies that are available for healthcare, for education, for training, to use those resources that this bill will unlock in order to do the things that APA called for, rather than this amendment which simply calls for a report summarizing what was heard.
Senator, to wrap up then, Senator Patterson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I proposed this amendment because I thought it was a reasonable response to the concerns expressed by the Aboriginal people. And yes, indeed, Senator Wu is right that it calls for the government to make a detailed report on the issues and the measures to be taken. That would require commitments from the government respecting the concerns expressed by Indigenous peoples. The timing of the report is in the hands of the government, and they clearly are. This is a priority to carry out this election promise. But may I remind colleagues, the Prime Minister himself has said there's no more important relationship for this government than that with Aboriginal peoples. And I will respond to Senator Munson. You know, it's a parliamentary tradition to say with the greatest of respect, I disagree with the parliamentary colleague. The consultation was inadequate. I've got the record here. And there was an online consultation with the task force. 0 responses from Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. 0. No responses whatsoever. I also, well, because they didn't go there. The first consultations were held in Toronto, 2 in Vancouver, and nobody ever went to the territories until questions started to be asked long after the bill had been drafted and tabled. Now, I also want to, I will say respectfully to my colleague, Senator Gold, I don't agree that the duty to consult does not extend to the legislative process. When Aboriginal peoples are impacted by legislation, there is a duty to consult, I believe. This is a terribly vulnerable population. I don't want to speak about the epidemics of suicide, the crises of social issues. I don't think I need to speak about that here. You know, people in my region are paying $50 to $100 for not even a gram of marijuana. It's supposed to be a gram. It's not even a gram. And because of geography and remoteness, it's inaccessible. Under this legislation, the price is going to go down to $10, and it's going to be available by telephone or online. We've heard evidence that Aboriginal people and people who've been victims of intergenerational trauma and post-traumatic stress are vulnerable to mental problems from the use of marijuana, especially young people. We have severe problems with alcohol and drug abuse in our Aboriginal communities. I made this recommendation for this amendment because I thought it would be an impetus to shine a light on these issues. Parliamentary Secretary Blair gave us a few minutes on what's happening. There were things in Budget 2018 that allowed these things to happen. There's no detail. There's no guarantee of any results. I think we need more detail and more attention focused on this issue. And if we can get the government to move and act more effectively and more respectfully because of these amendments, it'll be a win-win for all concerned. Nobody wants the Aboriginal community social issues in a vulnerable social fabric in Aboriginal communities to get worse. And that's what Aboriginal peoples are saying. The communities that support the legislation want a piece of the revenues. That's a very big issue, the new fiscal relationship. Do you think after the bill is passed, the federal, provincial, and territorial finance ministers are going to say, yeah, we made a mistake, we should have carved up the pie amongst Aboriginal peoples? It has to happen beforehand. And I will also say this, and to Senator Gold, I believe, who made the point. There's no clarity about the ability of Aboriginal peoples to govern themselves on this issue, about their ability to prohibit marijuana in their communities. Justice Canada Council at the Aboriginal Peoples Committee said laws of general application will prevail over the Indian Act, given there's no express provisions in the Indian Act to allow prohibition of cannabis. So this law is going to impinge on the right of self-government that many Aboriginal peoples have been encouraged to think will be respected by this government. Minister Bennett is coming to the committee next week to report on Bill S3, to answer your question, Senator Lankin. So with all respect, the government's consultation has been abysmal with the Aboriginal people. Our committee is an expert in this because we have studiously examined consultation and found it wanting with S3, and the Senate as a whole supported us to have the proper job done. So it hasn't been effective, and that's why the Assembly of First Nations made a clear resolution to delay for a year. All 600 chiefs specially assembled to look at this bill. Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated made the same resolution, but I'm not asking for a delay of up to a year. I'm giving, by this amendment, the government an opportunity to focus on this issue and come back to us in a timely manner with what they're going to do. It may be a great story. According to Parliamentary Secretary Blair, there's great things happening in this area. Let them come back and tell us and satisfy us. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. So JS 15 is before us. Do you want to record a vote on this? Yep, okay. Are we ready? Okay.
The Honourable Senator Eggleton, PC.
No.
The Honourable Senator Bernard. The Honourable Senator Gold. L'Honourable Sénatrice Mégy. The Honourable Senator Munson. The Honourable Senator Lankin, PC.
No.
The Honourable Senator Patterson.
Yes.
L'Honourable Sénatrice Petitclerc.
No.
The Honourable Senator Plett. L'Honourable Sénatrice Poirier. The Honourable Senator Seidman.
Yes.
The Honourable Senator Stuart Olson. Yeas pour 5-5, nays contre 7-7.
Accordingly, the motion is defeated. So now we have the following question. Shall Part 15 entitled Coming into Force, which contains Clause 226, as amended by the TD 31, as amended, carry? Is that agreed? On division. We now have 6 schedules. I have no amendments proposed in the 6 schedules, so I will take them all as one. Shall schedules 1 to 6 carry? Carry. On division. Shall clause 1, which contains the short title, carry? Carry. Shall the title carry? Carry. On division. Shall the bill as amended carry? On division. Recorded vote on shall the bill as amended carry?
The Honourable Senator Eggleton.
Yes.
The Honourable Senator Bernard. The Honourable Senator Gold. L'Honourable Sénatrice Mégy. The Honourable Senator Munson. The Honourable Senator Lankin, PC.
Yes.
The Honourable Senator Patterson.
No.
L'Honourable Sénatrice Petitclerc.
Oui.
The Honourable Senator Plett.
No.
L'Honourable Sénatrice Poirier.
No.
The Honourable Senator Seidman.
No.
The Honourable Senator Stuart Olson. Yeas pour 7-7, nays contre 5-5.
Accordingly, the motion is carried. The bill as amended is